everybody. I've done videos in the past about creating good character designs, and I went and rewatched them, and they hold up. I was worried that my advice was stinky and bad, but they're pretty good, so I stand by them pretty much. But today, I wanted to go more into how to finesse your designs. Like, once you have your character designed, how do you kind of take the next step to making it more to your vision for your webtoon, your story. I will quickly go over good character design starting points in case you don't want to chase down like one of our old videos, but I'll go over them briefly here so it won't take up the whole runtime. My basic tips for creating good character designs. The first step is to understand your character's personality. That is where most of their style choices will come from, for what they dress in. It can be a way to inform the way they look, because a lot of people look like their personalities, and it can be a quick way to show your character's personality visually, because in comics and webtoons it's a visual medium, etc. And along the same line, it's really important to understand the character's purpose in the story, because you can use their design to show your reader who they are in the story. For example, villains can look villainous, heroes can look like your typical hero, and you can also play with the opposite of that. You may have a character who turns out to be a very evil, awful person, who is the villain of the story, but at the start they look very sweet and nice, and they come across that way visually in how they act, and then it's revealed later that they're nasty and evil. So yeah, understanding how to play with expectations based on your character's purpose, that's all really important to understand. Another thing to understand about your characters is the style choice for your overall story. You may, for example, decide to go with a style for this particular comic that is very, I don't know, maybe you choose like a kind of blocky, simplified, big-eyed style, kind of like Scott Pilgrim, you know? That can influence how it can add limitations to how your characters look. So it's important to understand, like, how do I take this character and make sure that they fit in with the style of this story? And to drill down into like how to portray your character's personality, their purpose, and to mingle it in with your own style for the story, you can use shapes and color to help portray your character quickly to your reader. So this can be like using circles and having a very round character who's supposed to be like very soft and sweet, versus maybe using triangles for your character shapes if they're supposed to be like clever or evil. Those are common shape language things. And same with color language. You may have a character who's very passionate and romantic. You might use reds and purples and pinks and stuff. And you may have a character who's, I don't know, supposed to be like venomous or vicious or whatever. You might use some like neon greens and blacks. Think like Maleficent type stuff, you know? Colors and shapes have a language established across visual medium, so use that to your advantage. Other things to think about are like motifs for a particular character. There can be different reasons for different motifs. For one, you can use like the general shape language stuff like I was talking about, so like circles, squares, triangles, etc. But you may have a character where like maybe they have like a butterfly kind of motif running through their design for like a whole bunch of different reasons. It could be like, I don't know, they're a fairy and then they have butterfly wings and you want to use that throughout the rest of their design. But you can use other kind of more subtle things, like maybe this character is going to go through like a metamorphosis kind of thing, so you're using butterfly as a symbolism in their design. Or maybe their mother was, I don't know, it's important to the plot that they love butterflies because their mom loved butterflies. I don't know. Lots of ways to play around with that. And lastly, and I'm going to reiterate this later, the best advice I have for when you're designing your characters for your comic is to keep the design simple. It'll save you a lot of work in the long run. Comics involve drawing the same character over and over again. If the designs are simple, it's simpler to draw. So there you go. That's the basics of like character design. And like I said, I've got a bunch of videos about those, which you can track down if you would like more in-depth talk about that stuff. Okay, so now let's say you have your character designed. You've maybe made it with all these tips in mind or not, doesn't matter. But you have your character, and you're not sure if this design is good, or you think like I could make this better. Like, where do you start? How do you get there? I get a lot of people in our monthly critique stream who are kind of in this boat where they have character designs for a comic they're working on, or maybe like a D&D campaign, and they just want feedback on it because they're like, I've been staring at this forever. I don't know if this is good. Where do I go from here? What do I do from here? And that brings me to my first piece of advice for finessing your character design. Get someone else's eyes on it. That can be intimidating, but it's very valuable to your work. To have someone, it can be a friend, it can be a critique group, it can be a creative partner, it could be our critique streams that we do every month. More information on our Patreon. Click down below if you're interested. You can ask people who follow your work if you post your work online. Classmates. You could ask your mom. You could be like, Mom, look at this character. What do you think? If you're comfortable doing that. But getting someone else to look at it, your character design is so helpful, because they might see things that you cannot see because you've been staring at it for a long time. Our brains tend to put down, like, it's the reason we make typos, is we'll miss a word in a sentence and our brain's like, well, I meant to put that there, so we'll just completely glance by the missing word and not notice it. But as soon as someone else looks at our sentence that we've written, they'll be like, oh, you're missing that word. You'll probably get that effect where maybe you forgot to put something in and someone will notice. The other disadvantage we have looking at our own work is that we understand our intentions, maybe on a more conscious level than that typo example, and it's hard to guess what other people will perceive having no knowledge of our character. So we're very biased when we look at our own characters and work, because we're like, we know all the information. I don't know if this looks like how I want it to look. So when you have your feedback person, whoever this is, a great place to start is to just give them the character design and ask for like the vibes that your character gives off to them. I think it's best to do this without telling them the story. Sometimes it's even helpful to be like, I'm not telling you what role this character has in my story, just like, what do you think they're like? What's their personality? What part in the story do you think they play, etc. And them having zero impression of like what your story is, who the character is, you can get some very interesting feedback, because sometimes they will look at a character and let's say you have this like creepy ghost girl who's supposed to show up, and it's very clear that she's very scary and threatening and she's a spooky ghost, right? And you may show someone this character design and they look at it and they're like, oh my gosh, is that like a cute fairy princess? And you're like, oh no, I have made a mistake. They might tell you that you are completely off base, and you can ask them like, well, why do you think that? And you're like, oh, well, they're wearing this like dress, and I thought this was like a crown, and it turns out it was like a weapon that's been lodged in their head, and that's how they died, because they're a ghost. So they can tell you if you're kind of off the mark. They can take guesses, and sometimes on the opposite side of things, they might say like, oh, that's a really cool creepy ghost girl, and you're like, yes, I'm on the right track. And it's just nice to have that like affirmation that you're doing the right thing. I would say when getting this feedback from people, it helps to have multiple people look at the same design if you're really not sure, because sometimes someone can be an outlier. You might show a design to like 5 people, and one of them is like, oh, the ghost girl is a fairy princess, and the rest of them are like, oh, that's a scary ghost girl. So yeah, sometimes people just don't get it. But sometimes everyone tells you it's a fairy princess, and you're like, oh no, back to the drawing board. And once you have their first impression, it can be helpful for you to detail like what the character is actually like what their purpose in the story is, maybe some details about like the story and world building, context that's needed for this character, and you can see if they agree. Because I've had that when I'm doing feedback for our critique streams, where they'll say, oh, this ghost girl, she died from like I can't think of a good example. But they might tell me like, oh, this character, they are supposed to be kind of like off-putting and look like a villain when they're first introduced, but it turns out they're an ally later. And it's like, oh, well, I totally got that feeling because I was looking at them and I thought, oh, their design is kind of scary, but they also look kind of nice. just from their expression. So like you can get good feedback once after that initial like first impression. You can get good feedback once you start giving context and diving into the character design. And it can be a really great way to kind of start looking for ways to change the design and improve it. Once you've made changes, it can be helpful to go back to the same person because they'll have context of like what the character looked like before and what your intention is, and they can maybe help give more advice and finesse the character even more. It can also be helpful to show it to new people and just get more fresh feedback and see if you're on the right track. Totally depends on like who is available to you, you know? It can be hard sometimes. So another way to ensure that your characters are cohesive and the design is making sense, a good place to start is using like the 4 quarters test. I don't even know if that's what it's called. Basically, you take your character, if they're standing straight on facing you, if you cut a line down the very middle of them vertically and cut a line through the middle of them horizontally, and so that would create 4 quarters of them. You'd want all of those quarters to look like they come from the same character. So this doesn't mean it has to be symmetrical, obviously, but you want to make sure that every piece of your character feels like it comes from the same place. What I often see when I'm doing my critiques is people will often put a lot of character-heavy detail into the face and the torso and the upper half of the body, but I find a lot of the time people will and myself included, I am also guilty of this, will take a lot less detail and a lot less character into the lower half of the character. The legs will typically be very plain, same with shoes. So it's just something to really keep in mind when you're designing your character, that the whole character needs to look as detailed and refined. Because if you look at yourself, when you are, say, getting dressed, you're not only thinking about your shirt and your hair. You're also thinking about your pants and your shoes, maybe your skirt, maybe your dress, whatever you wear, you know? It is all character driven. And it can be the same with like proportions. You may have a character who is, say, like very muscular, and maybe you want that to show through like their whole body and not just their torso. So yeah, cutting your character into quarters, as horrific as it sounds, is very good for character design. Along the same line, something that can be really helpful when designing your comic characters is to compare, when you're working on one character design, compare it to the rest of your cast, so your other character designs in the same work. It can be hard when, say, they're at like different stages of the design process, like maybe you're refining one character and the rest of them are still kind of behind, but it is still very helpful. You want them to all look like they're from the same universe. You want, like, while still looking different is the thing. You don't want your characters to all look the same. And having them all lined up together, it can be really helpful to see where they look similar and cohesive and where they can branch out and be their own character. And this can come from like body type, it can come from costuming, it can come from colors. Like maybe you realize, oh, all my characters are blonde and there's no reason for that. I just kept making blonde characters, and you maybe want to change the hair colors. It could have to do with height. Maybe your characters are all the same height and you're like, oh, maybe I should have some short characters and some taller characters, etc. Another thing to look at is, when you're looking at a single character, is there a way you can push their form or their style further? So for example, say you're drawing a character who's supposed to be like really muscular and strong, and you're looking at them like without it becoming ridiculous. Obviously you don't want, I'm not saying you have to push every characteristic to the very extreme. Like they don't all have to look like Dragon Ball Z characters, unless you want to. That's fine. But if you have a character who's supposed to be strong, it is helpful to look at them and say like, can I bulk them up more, for example? And you can do this with any trait. Just kind of like, can I push this vampire character to look even more vampire-y? Or do they look too plain? Or maybe you have a character who's supposed to be very plain and kind of blend in with the background, and can you push them to be even more plain and unrecognizable? Maybe they look too unique. How far can you push these traits visually? And I think it's always helpful to kind of sit down and ask yourself if you can push it further. I personally look at costuming and like what your character wears specifically. One thing I used to fall back on, I still kind of do, but one thing I used to do is, all my characters are dressed in like t-shirts and jeans. And it's like, okay, sometimes that is applicable. Maybe you have a character who they are comfortable wearing t-shirts and jeans and that's all they wear. But is there a way you can push it so that it is unique to their style? It can be the same with characters wearing uniforms, whether that's like a military uniform or a school uniform. Is there a way, even when they're all wearing the same clothes, is there a way you can portray their personality further by the way they wear their uniform? These are all really important to think of, and it can really kind of like bring your characters further. How far can you push it without like going too far and still matching your style and staying in the realm of what you want your characters to look like? So the last thing that I think is really important to highlight, checking your like stereotyping in your character design. I don't know if that makes sense. Kind of checking your biases and checking if you're using any like visual symbols or visual shorthands. The one I always think of is if you have a character who's supposed to be like smart or nerdy, you put glasses on them. That's like a visual shorthand for like the smart nerdy character, right? Sometimes you may want that, especially with side characters. You may want to use maybe more stereotypical designs for them because they're going to be there for a short time. You maybe want to show who they are really, really quickly, whereas like your main characters can have more nuance to their design. I think it's important to just kind of check what you're doing and make sure you're doing it intentionally, if that makes sense. Because sometimes that stuff can be useful, and sometimes it can be limiting in your designs. Like I said, a main character can be more nuanced. For example, going back to the glasses example, a lot of people just wear glasses. Like, some people are just born with eyes that require glasses. And a lot of people, as they get older, require glasses as we age. Like, personally, I recently got glasses because my eyes aren't working so well as they used to, because I look at a lot of screens. So it can be a way to add character to your characters. Or it can be a way to not add character to your characters. I don't know. Does that make sense? Just consider like what you're using and if it is suitable to your story and your characters. And along the same lines, on I guess like a more serious note, I would say when you're working on your character designs, push for like diversifying your characters as much as you can. Now, this is a personal check I have to do on myself. My like default character that I often draw is very thin and white. That's just what I gravitate towards. And I don't like it a lot. It can be really limiting and really boring. And I know for me, I know where it comes from. It's just like all the media I've always enjoyed has been all white characters and they're all super thin. So I know where that comes from, but I don't like it. I want more diverse casts personally. Now, this doesn't mean you can, like, obviously for me, like, I can still create white, thin characters, but I like to push myself to have characters who have different body types and are from different cultures, just because it creates more interesting design and more realistic design. And this isn't to say that like you have to look down your lineup of characters and make sure that they're all like super, super different from each other in all these different ways, but it's something to like consider, you know? Check your biases, remove stereotypes, just because you'll get a more interesting character designs, more realistic worlds, you know, all that good stuff. One of the things that really got me thinking about this and why it's useful, I mean, besides it being realistic to our world, that people are diverse. Recently, I read the book Manga in Theory and Practice by Hirohiko Araki, which is a fantastic read, by the way. If you are making comics, I highly recommend it, especially if you are influenced by manga. But one of the highlights from that book was that, so the author, he's the creator of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, and which is a long-running shonen manga that's been going on for decades with multiple arcs. One of the things he pointed out is that if you're creating a long-running series like a shonen manga, you're going to have lots and lots of characters throughout your story, and you don't want to have the same note character happening over and over again. You don't want all your characters to look the same, you want them to be distinct. And so the way that he goes about ensuring that all his characters are different is he writes these incredibly detailed, like, character backgrounds. And he draws inspiration from, like, travel, consuming, like, different media, just, like, pulling from all kind of walks and ways of life. By doing that and understanding how, like, different all the characters are from each other, like, understanding their personalities very understanding their personalities very intimately, it inherently creates very unique designs, because depending on how someone is raised and their beliefs and their viewpoints on the world and their relationships, like, they're gonna present themselves differently than all the other characters, because they're all very different. And yeah, it was really cool to see. And I think it works the same for even if you're not writing, like, a very long running series, even if you're creating more self-contained stories, one-off stories, you want, between your different works, you want your characters to be very distinct from each other, even if maybe your works all pull from, like, similar themes or from similar genres. You want all of your characters to be very unique. And so, yeah, I just thought that was really great, insightful advice. And it all comes down to understanding your character's personality. So we love that. But yeah, you definitely should read Manga in Theory and Practice. It is really, really good. And finally, I'm going to reiterate what I said near the beginning of this video. You can take your design and, like, push it really far and make your character super, super unique to themselves, and that's super awesome. But I really encourage you to, once you've done all that, to pull it back and simplify the character as much as you can for your comic, because, like I said, you're going to be drawing them over and over again, and the more simple your design is, the easier it is to draw over and over again really quickly, which is very important when you are making comics, because they take so long. I'll also say there isn't, like, a right way to design characters. Like, I can give all this advice about, like, things that I've found helpful, but, you know, characters are all very unique. It really depends on, like, the needs of your story. And in the end, you're the final judge of if you really like your character's design or if it's not working for your story. So go forth, design wonderful characters that you enjoy. If you're not sure where to start, I definitely would look at character designs that you enjoy and kind of pick them apart, understand why you like them, what really works, what makes them unique, and go from there. And I hope this has been helpful. I really do. I hope I'm not up here saying nonsense. Thanks for listening. If you are someone who needs your characters critiqued so you can take them the next step further in being amazing character designs, consider signing up for our Patreon, and you can get in on our monthly critique streams. I've been told they're very helpful. So there you go. That's my pitch. And the other thing I personally would like to know is, what are things that you struggle with when you're designing your characters? Because, like I said, I can tell you all these things from my own experiences and what I've read, but I don't know what's, like, you're struggling with. I would like to know, because maybe I can make more videos that are helpful and cover more things. Let me know. Let me know what you're struggling with. I'll see what I can do. That's it. Goodbye. Love you all.